The conflict that Washington described 30 days ago as a targeted, limited operation against Iranian nuclear infrastructure is no longer that. It may have started as that. The first 48 hours may have resembled that. But what is now operating in the field across 7 simultaneous theaters, coordinated through a command and communications architecture that the American intelligence community is still attempting to fully map, is something categorically different. The Yemeni armed forces have officially entered the war, not as a peripheral actor conducting opportunistic harassment operations, as a declared combatant executing what their own official statement describes as the second major military operation within the ongoing battle, conducted simultaneously with the campaigns of their brethren in Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles aimed at military targets in southern occupied Palestine, launched in coordination with IRGC ballistic operations and Hezbollah strike packages across the northern front. 3 separate military organizations operating across Yemen, Lebanon, and Iran, hitting the same adversary from 3 different geographic axes within the same operational window. If that pattern of coordination describes an enemy that is fragmented, degraded, and approaching exhaustion, the definition of those words has changed in ways that the operational record does not support. Subscribe to From Report right now and activate the notification bell, because what follows is the analytical picture that assembles when you read what the Yemeni armed forces actually said, what the USS Tripoli's arrival in the region actually represents, and what the combination of those 2 developments means for an operation that was supposed to be over before it reached this point. The Yemeni armed forces statement deserves to be read in its precise terms rather than summarized, because the language it uses is not the language of a proxy force conducting operations at the direction of a patron. It is the language of an independent military actor making a sovereign declaration of war aims. The statement describes the Houthi operation as executed through a significant volley of advanced cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, precisely aimed at a considerable number of critical, vital, and military targets. It describes the operation as occurring simultaneously with the military campaigns being conducted by the brethren in Iran and Hezbollah. And it closes with an explicit commitment to continue military operations until the criminal enemy ceases its brutal attacks and aggression. That is not a statement of conditional engagement subject to Iranian approval. That is a declared war aim with its own defined endpoint. The Yemeni armed forces are not announcing that they will fight until Iran negotiates a deal. They are announcing that they will fight until the attacks on what they describe as the nation stop. Those are different conditions with different implications for any diplomatic process that Washington is attempting to construct simultaneously with its military operations. The 2-track strategy of negotiations and military pressure requires a negotiating partner who can deliver the compliance of all forces fighting under the Iranian umbrella. The Yemeni armed forces statement suggests that whatever that umbrella consists of, the organizations operating under it have their own conditions that a deal between Washington and Tehran may not automatically satisfy. The operational significance of the Yemeni front opening simultaneously with IRGC and Hezbollah operations is not primarily about the damage produced by any individual Houthi strike package. It is about what the simultaneous coordination of 3 separate military organizations across 3 separate geographic theaters does to the defensive and intelligence architecture of the forces opposing them. American and Israeli military planners have spent 30 days attempting to manage a conflict with Iran and Hezbollah on 2 primary fronts, while simultaneously navigating Houthi pressure on Red Sea shipping lanes as a secondary concern. A Houthi force that was conducting Red Sea shipping harassment while Iran and Israel fought a bilateral war required a different level of attention than a Houthi force that has now officially declared itself a co-combatant, executing synchronized strike operations against Israeli military targets in coordination with the IRGC and Hezbollah within the same operational windows. The shift in Houthi posture from supporting actor to declared co-combatant is not a semantic distinction. distinction. It is an expansion of the number of independent military organizations that must be tracked, countered, and addressed simultaneously before any ceasefire framework can be described as comprehensive. Every additional front requires attention. Every additional front that is coordinated with other fronts multiplies the complexity of the defensive task by more than its individual contribution to the threat. The arrival of the USS Tripoli in the United States Central Command area of responsibility needs to be examined against this backdrop, because the timing and scale of that deployment tell a specific story about where American military planning is currently headed. The USS Tripoli is an amphibious assault ship. It is not primarily a strike platform. It is a vessel designed to deliver, support, and sustain ground forces in an amphibious assault context. It arrived carrying approximately 3,500 Marines and soldiers, strike fighter aircraft, transport systems, and amphibious combat assets. These forces join thousands of American Marines and paratroopers already positioned in the region. Reports indicate that the Pentagon is preparing contingency plans for extended ground operations in Iran, potentially lasting several weeks, in preparation for a decision by the president to intensify the conflict. Reports also indicate that Washington is considering deploying up to 10,000 additional troops to the Middle East. The arrival of an amphibious assault ship loaded with Marines at this specific moment in this specific conflict, combined with these specific planning disclosures, describes a military posture that is not consistent with a force positioning itself to conclude a limited air operation. It is consistent with a force positioning itself to execute options that the current phase of the conflict has not yet included. The Iranian response to these signals is not ambiguous. Iran's armed forces published a 59-second video that has now been distributed across global media. The video shows elite commandos executing tactical drills, heavy firepower demonstrations, explosions, troops advancing through rough terrain, and a missile launcher vehicle firing its weapon. The message delivered alongside that footage requires no translation and no analytical inference. Come close. We are waiting for you. The Iran Times, the country's English-language daily, carried a front page on March 28th under a headline that has since circulated widely: "Welcome to Hell." The subtext of that message is explicit. Any United States troops who set foot on Iranian soil will leave only in a coffin. Iran is not conducting signaling operations through back channels or diplomatic intermediaries. It is using its state media, its official military communications infrastructure, and its public-facing English-language newspaper to deliver a message directly to an American audience in terms that leave no room for interpretive uncertainty. That is a government that believes its deterrent message needs to reach not just decision-makers in Washington, but the American public, whose political pressure those decision-makers ultimately answer to. The disconnect between the public diplomatic posture of the Trump administration and its simultaneous military buildup is the analytical element that carries the most weight for understanding where this conflict is actually heading. The administration's public positioning describes two simultaneous tracks. Diplomatic: the president is open to a deal, wants negotiations, and believes the Iranian side has shown interest in talking. Military: forces are being positioned, options are being created, and the commander-in-chief has not made additional decisions yet. White House spokesman language is precise on this point. The Pentagon is creating maximum optionality for the commander-in-chief. That phrase, maximum optionality, is the institutional language used to describe a military buildup that preserves the decision-maker's ability to escalate without committing to escalation. It is the language used when the planning is complete and the decision is pending. The addition of 3,500 Marines aboard the USS Tripoli, joining thousands already in theater, joining the hundreds of special operations forces, including Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, already forward deployed, joining the planning documents for extended ground operations, does not describe an administration primarily focused on diplomatic resolution. It describes an administration that is keeping the diplomatic track alive as a public-facing communication strategy while building the military capacity to pursue a fundamentally different option. Reports indicate that American forces being positioned in the region could be located within striking distance of Karg Island, Iran's critical oil export hub. Karg Island is not a peripheral infrastructure node. It is the facility through which the vast majority of Iranian crude oil reaches global markets. An operation targeting Karg Island would represent a qualitative escalation from what has been conducted in this conflict's first 30 days. The energy market consequences of removing Karg Island's export capacity from global supply, simultaneously with the ongoing Strait of Hormuz closure and the accumulated damage across Gulf energy infrastructure, would be of a scale that the oil price movement seen thus far would only partially anticipate. The administration's own oil industry executives have already warned in a White House meeting that the current disruption trajectory approaches the threshold beyond which structural consumer behavior change, rather than temporary price adjustment, becomes the dominant market response. A Karg Island operation would not approach that threshold. It would cross it. The question that this operational picture forces analytical attention toward is one that the official framing of both tracks has consistently avoided stating directly. The 72-hour operation that was supposed to resolve the Iranian nuclear question and establish American deterrence in the region is entering its second month with every declared objective unachieved, with the adversary's military capacity across Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq demonstrating a sustained coordination capability that was not factored into the pre-operation assessment, with American forces taking losses that official characterizations have consistently understated, and with a military buildup now underway that is consistent with an escalation to ground operations rather than a conclusion of air operations. The president himself acknowledged in public remarks that the 1% problem is the defining constraint on the current air campaign. A 99% success rate against Iranian missile launch capacity is not operationally sufficient when 1% means a hypersonic missile striking the hull of a billion-dollar ship. That is not a temporary problem to be solved by additional strikes. It is an argument for the mathematical impossibility of achieving the campaign's declared objectives through air power alone. And it is an argument that, followed to its logical conclusion, leads directly to the ground option that the USS Tripoli and its 3,500 Marines are now positioned to enable. Iran's proxy network understands this logic. The Yemeni Armed Forces statement confirms that Houthi forces view their entry into synchronized strike operations not as an independent initiative, but as part of a coordinated strategic response to the escalation trajectory. Hezbollah's operations into northern Israel have continued at a tempo inconsistent with a degraded force operating at the margins of its capability. IRGC strike coordination across multiple theaters has demonstrated a command and communications resilience that 30 days of air operations have not broken. The force that was supposed to be exhausted by day 5, fragmented by day 10, and approaching collapse by day 30 has instead added a declared co-combatant, sustained simultaneous multi-theater operations, and published a message to the American public telling them precisely what they will face if ground troops arrive on Iranian soil. Here is where the picture stands. The Yemeni armed forces have officially declared themselves co-combatants, executing synchronized operations with the IRGC and Hezbollah against Israeli targets. The USS Tripoli has delivered 3,500 Marines and amphibious combat assets to the Central Command area of responsibility. The Pentagon is preparing contingency plans for extended ground operations lasting several weeks. Reports indicate planning for up to 10,000 additional troops. American Special Operations Forces, including Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, are already forward deployed. Iran has published a direct public message, "Welcome to Hell," specifically addressed to American ground forces. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed to Western commercial shipping, and the operation that was described 30 days ago as targeted and limited is now generating planning documents for a ground phase that its original architects did not publicly describe as part of the plan. Subscribe to From Report and turn on notifications. When the decision on ground operations takes a form that the positioning of the USS Tripoli makes operationally visible, the analysis will be here. When the Houthi declaration of co-combatant status produces a Red Sea shipping consequence that compounds the Hormuz closure, the analysis will be here. When the gap between the diplomatic track's public language and the military track's observable preparations narrows to the point where one of them has to give, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always.